The rain had been falling since morning, and the registry hall on Trim Street smelled of damp wool and candle wax, and the particular anxious quiet of people who had come to be assessed. Clara stood at the end of the row in her best gray dress, the cuffs pressed flat, her hands folded at her waist in the way Mrs. Pentecost had taught her before she died, still but not rigid, present but not forward. The fire in the grate had been allowed to burn low. There were 8 women in the row, and Clara was the 7th, and she had counted the iron nails in the floorboards twice already, because it was better than looking up. She heard him before she saw him. Heavy boot steps, measured rather than hurried, and a second set behind the first. The purposeful rhythm of a man who rarely reconsidered his direction. Clara allowed herself one glance at the door. Lord Aldous Cavendish, Earl of Hartwell, entered the room like a man walking into a verdict he had already prepared himself to accept. He was tall and silver-haired, with the kind of face that had once been striking and had since settled into something more severe. He wore a dark traveling coat, travel-stained at the hem, and he carried his hat in his hand, rather than surrendering it at the door. Behind him came a younger man, 30 or so, with the same dark brows and the same measured gait, dressed more precisely, watching the room rather than any particular person in it. Mrs. Pentecost's successor, a thin woman named Mrs. Rowe, moved forward to begin the presentations. Lord Aldous listened with the absent courtesy of a man whose attention was elsewhere. Then he reached Clara. He stopped. Not the polite hesitation of a gentleman reviewing a candidate. Something else entirely. He went absolutely still, the way a man goes still when a sound from a room he believed empty resolves itself into a name. His son Edmund, standing 2 steps behind, noticed. Clara could see it in the slight forward shift of the younger man's weight, the narrowing of his eyes. She looked back at the Earl. His face had done something she could not immediately name. Not grief, not hope, but the awful suspended space between the two where neither is yet safe to feel. "Your eyes," Lord Aldous said very quietly, and then stopped himself. Mrs. Rowe cleared her throat. "Miss Clara Moss, my lord. 3 years at Lindham Park. References from the late Mrs. Pentecost and from Reverend Harker of Compton Wick, who instructed her in reading and household accounts." The Earl nodded once, as though the information had reached him from a great distance. "She will do," he said. The words were almost involuntary. Edmund Cavendish said nothing. Clara, watching him from the corner of her eye, saw his jaw set in the precise, controlled way of a man arriving at a suspicion he would rather not have confirmed. Clara had been called a maid's get all her life. It was what she was, what the world had decided she was, before she was old enough to decide anything herself. And she had made her peace with that word the way you make your peace with a cold house. You do not love it, but you learn where every draft comes from. The Moss family, who had taken her in for the parish shillings and then let her go when the shillings stopped, had told her she was born of nothing and going back to nothing, and the best she could hope for was to be useful and grateful and quiet. Reverend Harker had thought otherwise. He had put books in her hands and made her read them aloud until her vowels were clear and her sentences were complete, and when she asked him why he bothered, he had said that a mind was a mind, regardless of whose it was. She had believed him. In the way you believe something a good person tells you when you are 12 and afraid. She had carried the belief through 5 years of service, through the ache of watching families in drawing rooms she was permitted to clean but never to enter, through the long evenings in the servants' hall when the other girls talked about their mothers and she had nothing to add. She had carried it to Bath, where she had presented herself to Mrs. Rowe with references she was quietly proud of, and she had been told 3 times that week by the hall's senior attendant, a florid woman named Hartley, that she was nothing but a charity case with no name, and that any placement she received would be more than she deserved. Clara had smoothed her gray dress and said, "Yes, Miss Hartley," and believed none of it, and all of it simultaneously, in the particular way of a woman who has been told the same thing so many times that it has ceased to wound and begun to merely occupy space. She had not expected anything from the interview on Trim Street. She had not expected the Earl of Hartwell to stop as though a door had swung open in a wall he had ceased to believe contained a door. If there are moments that divide a life cleanly in two, and there are, though they rarely announce themselves at the time, that was one of them. Though Clara would not know it for several weeks yet. Hartwell Hall sat on the western edge of the Somerset levels, where the land goes flat and the sky comes very low, and the light at autumn morning is the color of old bone. It was a large house in the Georgian manner, neither particularly welcoming nor particularly cold, with 4 floors of gray stone with a long lime tree avenue and a stable yard that smelled of hay and leather, and the particular industry of a well-run estate. Clara was shown to a room on the upper servants' floor and given her duties by Mrs. Good, the housekeeper. A woman of broad chest and narrow opinions, who had been at Hartwell Hall since Edmund Cavendish was in short coats, and who had formed her views of the world's proper order before Clara's mother's mother was born. "You are a housemaid," Mrs. Good said, in the tone of a woman reading a legal document. "You will not speak to his lordship unless spoken to. You will not enter the East Gallery under any circumstances. You will take your meals below stairs, and you will not make yourself conspicuous. You are a useful appointment, not a guest, and no one will confuse the two." She paused, and then added, with the precise emphasis of someone underlining a word, "However his lordship may have come by you, you are still just a maid's get at the end of the day, and this household runs according to what a person is, rather than what someone's fancy makes of them." Clara said, "Yes, Mrs. Good," and carried her trunk upstairs alone. She was not conspicuous, or tried not to be. She learned the house the way she had learned every house, room by room, early in the morning when the fires needed laying, and the light came in long and gray before the family was awake. She learned which floorboards spoke and which ones did not. She learned that the Earl took his breakfast in the East Room with a view of the avenue, that he kept the same hours every day with the quiet discipline of a man who has learned that routine is a form of self-protection. She learned that Edmund Cavendish was at the hall for 6 days out of every 10, and that he was in the habit of arriving in the study at 8:30 and working until the light failed, rarely speaking to anyone in the household except on practical matters, and then in short, level sentences that gave nothing away. She learned that the East Gallery was indeed closed. She had not tried the door. She did not need to. The closed door was its own information, the kind you read the way you read a turned portrait or an untouched chair. Edmund Cavendish came into the hall's morning room on Clara's 5th day to find her restoring order to the bookshelves that the previous maid had, apparently, arranged by height alone. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. Clara was aware of him in the particular uncomfortable way of someone who knows they are being assessed, but does not know for what. "You read," he said. It was not a question. She had replaced 3 books upright by their author's alphabetical order, and had not realized until this moment that he had noticed. "Reverend Harker taught me," she said. "I beg your pardon, my lord. I should not have rearranged them without asking." "No," he agreed. Then he said, "Leave them as you have put them. It is better." He left without explaining what he meant by better. Clara went back to the shelves and felt, rather than heard, the quality of attention he had brought into the room with him. Not the careless regard of a man looking past a servant, but a focused and slightly wary scrutiny that she could not yet interpret. It might have been suspicion. It might have been something else entirely. She did not let herself decide which. Lady Cecily Drevin arrived on the 12th day, in a carriage with her coat of arms on the door, and a footman who managed her bandboxes with the resigned efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. She was 42, and beautiful in the manner of a woman who had learned at 20 that beauty was a currency, and had been careful with it ever since. She wore traveling clothes in deep blue wool that managed to look both practical and expensive. And she entered the hall with the particular confidence of a woman who has been admitted before and expects to be admitted again. She noticed Clara on the 3rd day, in the drawing room. "Is that the new one?" she said to Mrs. Good, in the voice of a woman speaking about a piece of furniture whose provenance she doubted. "Miss Moss, my lady. Engaged last month." Lady Cecily considered Clara for a moment, with the level assessment of a woman who categorizes quickly. "A charity case with no name," she said, not unkindly, merely precisely, the way you state a fact that requires neither approval nor argument. "I trust she is capable, at least." Clara at the far end of the room heard every word. She continued polishing the grate with steady, even strokes, and did not allow her hands to pause. That evening, in the servants' hall, Agnes, who had been a kitchen maid at Hartwell for 2 years and had the frank, round-faced sympathy of a girl who had never learned to keep her kindness to herself, set down a cup of tea in front of Clara without being asked and said, "Don't mind her ladyship. She's been counting this house as half hers for 3 years. She doesn't like anything that wasn't there before." Clara wrapped her hands around the cup and said, "I have heard worse." Agnes gave her a long look. "I know you have," she said. "That's what worries me." Lord Aldous had said almost nothing to Clara in the 12 days since she arrived. He watched her. She felt it the way you feel weather, not on the surface of the skin, but in the bones, a pressure and change that the body registers before the mind catches up. When he passed her in a corridor, his footsteps slowed for a fraction of a second. When she was present at the edge of a room he occupied, he found reasons to remain. Once, in the entrance hall, he had reached out as though to steady her when she was in no danger of losing her footing, and then drawn his hand back before it completed the gesture, as if the muscle memory had moved ahead of his permission. She did not know what to make of it. She was not frightened, which surprised her. She thought she should have been. Edmund found his father in the East Gallery on a Tuesday evening in October, when a candle was burning on the side table, and the door, for the first time in 9 years, stood ajar. He pushed it open slowly. Lord Aldous was standing before the portrait at the gallery's end. It was a woman of perhaps 28, painted in the manner of the last century, in white and pale gold, with dark hair and a slight smile that suggested she had just finished saying something amusing and was waiting for the reply. Her eyes were gray-green, with the particular quality of light that Edmund had always associated with deep, still water. In the left iris, if you stood close enough, there was a small amber fleck, a painter's note, an accident of pigment, an intimate, particular detail that no one who had not stood before that portrait many times would ever notice. Edmund had stood before it many times. He knew the fleck. He knew where else he had seen it. His father did not turn when Edmund entered. He said very quietly, "Your mother's eyes, Edmund. She has your mother's eyes." Edmund did not answer immediately. The silence had the quality of something that had been held for a long time and was only now being set down. When Edmund was 8 years old, his mother had died of a fever 4 weeks after delivering a daughter she had named Eugenia after herself. The daughter had been taken. She had not been kidnapped in the sensational manner, but sold, surrendered, by a nursemaid who had lost her wages and found a family in Somerset, willing to pay for an infant no one was looking for yet. The investigation had lasted 3 years and resolved in nothing. Lord Aldous had grief enough for a man twice his age, and Edmund had watched it work on his father like water on stone, slow and persistent and irreversible. He had spent 24 years watching the man he loved most in the world be hollowed out by a loss that had no shape and no grave, and therefore no end. "Father," he said at last, "I know what you will say. Tell me you have sent Mr. Fenwick." "I sent him the day after we returned from Bath." Edmund turned from the portrait. He stood for a moment with his back to his father and his eyes on the closed east window, where the night had settled in and the lime trees were invisible, and there was nothing to look at but dark glass and the candle's reflection. He had been watching Clara Moss since the first morning. He had been watching her because he did not trust what hope did to his father, because he knew what a woman with a story and a face could do to a man who wanted desperately to believe, because he had seen, once, in his father's study, a letter from a man in Bath who claimed to have information about the lost daughter for a consideration of 50 guineas, and he had watched his father's hands tremble as he opened it and go still as he read the nothing it contained. He had been watching her because he did not dare let himself feel what he thought he might be beginning to feel, and suspicion was a cleaner and more available thing. He had also watched her in the morning room on the 4th day of her time here, when the youngest of the estate children, a boy of 5 named Thomas Greaves, who had no business being in the house at all, had gotten past the kitchen entrance and was crying in the passage outside the larder because he had lost his dog. Clara had found him there. She had sat down on the stone floor of the passage, in her best gray dress, without hesitation, without the smallest performance of reluctance that would have told the child he was an inconvenience to be managed. She had said, "Tell me the dog's name," with the matter-of-fact practicality of a person who understands that the first thing to do with a frightened creature is give it something useful to say. The boy had looked up at her through his crying and told her, and the giving of the name had steadied him in precisely the way she had intended. She had taken his hand and helped him look. They had found the dog asleep under the kitchen table, indifferent to the entire crisis it had caused, and the boy had pressed his face into the animal's neck with the whole body relief of a child whose world has been restored to its proper order. Clara had knelt beside them both for a moment, one hand on the dog's flank, and then she had returned the boy to the kitchen door and said nothing about it to anyone. Edmund had been in the corridor by accident and had stayed by design, and he had not told himself what he was doing. He turned back from the window. "What has Fenwick found?" he said. "Not yet. He writes that the Somerset records are incomplete. He has gone to Compton Wick." Edmund crossed to the door. At the threshold he stopped. He did not look at his father. He looked at the portrait. The gray-green eyes, the amber fleck, the slight smile that had waited 9 years in the dark of a closed gallery. "She is not performing anything," he said. "I have been watching for it. She is simply what she is." He left before his father could answer. Clara was given 3 days' notice on the 1st of November. It was Mrs. Good who delivered it. With the precision of a woman who had received her instructions and intended to execute them without embellishment. The household was reducing its staff for the winter season, she said. Miss Moss's position would not continue past the 4th. Her references were in order, and she would be provided with a letter. Clara received this in the corridor outside the linen room, with her hands at her sides and her face arranged into the expression she had developed over years of being told things she had not expected. Not surprised, not visibly hurt, simply attending. Lady Cecily Draven had been at the hall for a week, and in that week the drawing room had been reorganized 3 times, and a dinner party had been proposed for the following Friday, and Edmund Cavendish had been in the study until 10 each night, and had not, as far as Clara was aware, said a word to his father about the dismissal. She went upstairs and began to fold her dresses. Agnes came to her room that evening and sat on the end of the bed and did not say anything useful, and did not pretend to. "His lordship didn't order it," Agnes said after a while. "Mrs. Good acts on his lordship's instruction." "His lordship," Agnes said carefully, "has not been seen in the household today. He is at the East Gallery again." Clara put a folded dress into her trunk. "That is not my concern. It is if—" Agnes stopped herself. "Agnes." Clara turned. Her voice was steady, which cost her something. "I have had this happen before. I will have a reference. I will find another position. I have no grounds to expect anything else, and I am not going to build a story out of an old man's curiosity and persuade myself it means something it does not." She closed the trunk lid. "I am just a maid's get. I have always known it." Agnes looked at her for a long moment, her round face unhappy. "I don't think you know what you are," she said. "I think you've been told what you are so often you've stopped being able to see the difference." Clara did not answer. She sat on the edge of the bed after Agnes left and looked at the closed trunk and felt the particular quality of grief that has no visible object. Not weeping, not rage, only the dull, persistent ache of a hope you did not know you were carrying until it was gone. She had not been hoping. She had told herself that many times, in the way you tell yourself a thing that is almost true. She had told herself the Earl's attention was the eccentric kindness of a lonely man who perhaps missed a daughter of some kind, that the particular quality of his gaze was merely the sentimentality of age and grief, and had nothing to do with her specifically. She had told herself Edmund Cavendish's watchfulness was the reasonable suspicion of an heir protecting his father's dignity. She had told herself Hartwell Hall was a position like any other, and that she would leave it the way she had left every other position, with a neat reference and a forward-set chin, her hands occupied, and her face composed, and nothing of the place carried out the door with her except what a reference could summarize. She pressed her hands flat on the trunk and made herself name the thing she had not named. She had wanted, against everything she knew to be sensible, to be something more than a useful appointment. She had wanted, in the wordless animal way of a person who has been nameless their whole life, to belong somewhere. She said quietly to the closed room, "I know what I am." She did not know that Edmund Cavendish was at that moment standing in the corridor outside his father's study, holding a letter with a broken solicitor's seal, reading the same sentence for the 4th time. The letter was from Mr. Fenwick in Compton Wick. It was dated the 29th of October. It described, in the measured language of a man who understood that precision mattered, the record he had found in the parish register of St. Anselm's, Compton Wick, recording an infant girl received by the Moss family in the autumn of 23 years prior, entered under the name given by the receiving family of no recorded parentage. The receiving family's account, obtained by Mr. Fenwick from a surviving nephew, was consistent. A woman had arrived at the farm with the infant before dawn, and had left before the household properly woke. The woman had given no name. She had left, with the infant, a small ivory miniature. The receiving family had kept it for some years, and then pawned it when times were lean. Edmund found his father in the East Gallery and read the letter aloud. Lord Aldous sat down in the chair beside the side table very slowly, as a man sits when his knees have decided to act independently of the rest of him. He said nothing for a long time. Then he opened his breast pocket and removed a small ivory miniature that he had carried for 9 years since he recovered it from a pawnbroker in Glastonbury, and he set it on the table, and he sat looking at it. "Go and find her," he said. "Edmund, please." Edmund was already moving. He found her on the Lime Tree Avenue, carrying her trunk because she had not wanted to trouble anyone for help with it, walking in the thin morning light with her coat buttoned to the throat and her chin at the level angle of a woman who is resolved not to look back. He came out of the hall door and covered the distance between them in 3 long strides before she heard him and turned. She turned with the expression of someone who is expected to be called back, to be told something unwelcome, and is braced for it accordingly, head up, eyes level, hands still at her sides, not performing dignity, possessed of it, in the way of a person who has had nothing else, and learned to be careful with what they kept. Edmund stopped. He looked at her face, which he had been trying for 3 weeks not to look at too directly, and he let himself see what was there. The gray-green eyes, the amber fleck in the left one, her mother's exact particular light, the set of the jaw that was his own father's jaw in miniature, the combination of qualities that had been standing in front of him since the first morning and that he had been refusing, for his own protection and his father's, to fully understand. "Miss Moss," he said, "there is something my father wishes to tell you." She held his gaze for a moment. He saw the wariness in it, the long-schooled expectation of disappointment. "My lord," she said, "if this is a kindness offered to soften a dismissal, I would rather not hear it." "It is not a dismissal." He paused. The words he needed were not easily available. He had spent 24 years watching the empty place his sister had left, and he did not have language for what it was to see it filled. "Please, come back to the hall." She looked at him for a long breath. Something shifted in her face. Not hope? Not yet. But the careful lowering of the guard that precedes hope, like the first thin light before sunrise. She came. Lord Aldous was in the morning room. He stood when she entered, in the way of a man who is paying a respect he is owed for longer than he can say. He held the ivory miniature in his hands, and when Clara came to stand before him, he held it out to her. She took it. She looked at the face in it for a long time. It was a woman painted 25 years ago, in her middle 20s, with dark hair and gray-green eyes and a slight smile that suggested she was listening to something pleasing. In the left eye, the painter had caught an amber fleck with the precision of a man who has been asked to record an exact detail and understands why it matters. Clara's left eye, in the winter light of the morning room, held the same fleck. She had seen it in mirrors. She had thought, when she thought of it at all, that it was nothing. She looked up from the miniature to Lord Aldous Cavendish's face, which had the careful stillness of a man holding himself together by main force. "Who is she?" Clara said, though she understood already, in the bones, in the place where the draft comes from. "Her name was Eugenia," he said. "She was my wife." A pause. His voice did not waver. It was the steadiness of a man who has made peace with grief, but not with absence. "She died before I found you. I should have found you sooner. I have been sorry for that every day of the last 20 years. Clara looked at the miniature for a long time. She looked at the face that was her face, the eyes that were her eyes, the expression she had never known where she got. She said very quietly, "She looks kind." Lord Aldous' composure broke, precisely once, cleanly, and then he put it back together. "She was," he said. "She was the kindest person I have ever known." Clara held the miniature carefully in both hands. Tears came, not dramatically but inevitably, the way water comes through stone, not a flood, but persistent, the pressure of a long accumulation finally finding its way through. She thought of Reverend Harker, who had given her books and told her a mind was a mind, regardless of whose it was. She thought of Mrs. Pentecost's careful training. She thought of every room she had stood in the corner of, every house she had cleaned and left, every name she had answered to that was not her own. She did not look at Edmund. She was not ready for that yet. Edmund stood at the morning room door and did not come forward. He watched his father and the woman who was his sister, and he allowed himself to feel the thing he had been refusing to feel for 3 weeks, which was not the grief he had been guarding against, but its opposite, the unlikely warmth of a house that has been closed a long time and is only now opening a window. He had been wrong to order the dismissal. He had told himself he was protecting his father. He had been protecting himself from a hope he could not afford to let near him, and from a feeling he had no right to and had been developing in spite of that, quietly, in the manner of things that grow without asking permission. Clara was his sister. That fact occupied the immediate, necessary, absolute foreground. She had also been his father's maid. That was over now, and what she was now was a member of his family, which meant the feeling he had been refusing had not gone away, but had merely changed its available forms. That too would require care, and time, and the particular courage of a man who has taught himself not to want things, and must learn again. How? That was for later. The morning room, the open door, his father's face, the miniature in Clara's hands. That was now, and it was enough. The formal presentation was held on the 16th of November in the drawing room at Hartwell Hall, with a fire laid and the lime trees bare at the window, and 12 assembled guests who had come expecting, most of them, to hear an announcement of another kind altogether. Lady Cecily Draven stood near the fireplace in gray silk, with the expression of a woman waiting for a conclusion she believes she has already calculated. She had not been told what the announcement was. She had assumed. The assumption was visible in the particular set of her shoulders. Lord Aldous stood before them all with the straight spine of a man conducting the most important piece of business of his life, and Clara stood at his right hand in a gown of pale green that Agnes had found in a storage chest and pressed without being asked, and her hands were still at her sides. "I have asked you here," Lord Aldous said, "to bear witness to a restoration. 23 years ago, by an act of desperation and theft, my daughter was taken from this household and raised in another. She is returned to us." He paused. He looked at Clara, and the look contained everything he had not been able to say in the morning room. The whole long weight of 20 years of sorrow resolved into something that might, in time, become its opposite. "Miss Clara Cavendish, my daughter. She stands at my right hand." Lady Cecily Draven's hand tightened on her fan. She did not speak. She looked at Clara with the sudden recognition of a woman whose private calculation has been publicly overturned, and the recognition was not malice, only the quiet collapse of a confidence that had been placed in the wrong thing. The room was very still for a moment. Then Mr. Eddington, the Earl's oldest friend, who had been at Hartwell Hall longer than anyone except Mrs. Good, said in his plain country voice, "Well, there she is then." And the room exhaled. Edmund was standing at the edge of the gathering. He crossed it, in 3 strides, to his sister's side. He did not say anything. He simply stood beside her, which was the only thing available to him that said what he meant. Clara looked at him. And for the first time in a month, she saw his face without the guard that suspicion had put over it. Not cold, not watchful, only precise, and a little tired and carrying something she recognized because she had been carrying it herself. The long, particular grief of a person who has stopped believing in the thing they most want. She looked away. She was not ready for more than that. Not yet. With her father's hand at her shoulder, and the room settling around her like a house that has always been hers, but is only now learning to say so. That evening, after the guests had gone, after Lord Aldous had sat with her in the morning room for 2 hours, telling her everything he knew, and asking her everything she knew, after Mrs. Good had come to her door with a look on her face that Clara could not categorize, and had said stiffly that she hoped she would be comfortable, and that her room was to be moved to the family wing in the morning, after Agnes had wept unrestrainedly in the kitchen, and then brought up a tray she had not been asked to bring. Clara was alone in her old room on the upper servants' floor for the last time. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, with the ivory miniature in her hands when Edmund knocked. She said, "Come in." He came in and did not sit down because she had not offered it, and the room was small, and he was aware, sharply, of the particular awkwardness of a man who has spent 3 weeks studying someone's face for deception and is now required to say something truthful with his own. "I was wrong to dismiss you," he said. "I believed you were exploiting my father's grief, and I used the household as an instrument to remove you, and I should not have done it. I am sorry." Clara looked at the miniature. "You were protecting him." "I was protecting him badly, and with the wrong tools, and it nearly cost you." He stopped. He started again. "I did not know, when I did it, what you are. What you are to this family. I had watched you for 3 weeks, and I knew what you were before I knew who you were, and I acted against my own better observation. That is the part I cannot excuse." She looked up from the miniature. His face, without the guard, was the face of a man who has told himself not to want something for so long that he has forgotten how to want it, without also apologizing for it. She recognized this. She had a great deal of practice with it. "I told Agnes," she said, "that I was just a maid's get, and I knew what I was. She told me I had been told what I was so many times I had stopped being able to see the difference." She paused. "I think she was right." Edmund was quiet for a moment. "She often is," he said. Agnes. This was from Edmund Cavendish, something approaching humor. Clara was surprised enough that something shifted in her own face. Not quite a smile, but its precondition. The moment the expression assembles itself and waits for permission. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I intend to be a great deal less of an obstacle than I have been, if you will allow me the chance to show that." It was not a declaration. It was not a request. It was a precision, an announcement of intention in the manner of a man who knows that what he means cannot be said entirely yet, and chooses the truest available partial truth instead. Clara held the miniature. She thought of the gray dress, the flat cuffs, the registry hall on Trim Street. She thought of Mrs. Pentecost teaching her how to stand, still but not rigid, present but not forward. She thought of every threshold she had crossed into a house that was not hers. "Yes," she said, "I think I will." By Christmas, Clara Cavendish had been given her mother's rooms in the East Wing and had stood in the gallery before the portrait, long enough to stop expecting the face to be a stranger. The amber fleck in the painting's left iris had been there for 25 years, unobserved by anyone who had not known to look. Lord Aldous had taken down the black cloth he had covered it with 9 years before, and the light in the East Gallery at morning was particular and warm, the way light gets in a room that has been closed and is now permitted to breathe. On Christmas morning, Edmund came to find her in the gallery. She was holding the ivory miniature. She had taken to carrying it, not as a grief, but as a kind of orientation, the way you carry something that tells you where you are. He stood beside her before the portrait and did not speak for a moment. Outside the gallery's tall windows, snow was falling, the soft, unhurried snow of a settled winter, and the lime tree avenue was white and still. "She would have liked you," he said. Clara looked at her mother's face, the slight smile, the waiting expression, the eyes that were her own. "Reverend Harker told me once that a mind was a mind regardless of whose it was," she said. "I have spent 20 years not being entirely sure he was right." Edmund turned from the portrait to look at her, with the particular quality of attention she had learned over 6 weeks. To distinguish from surveillance, not watchful, not measuring, only present and careful, and carrying, at its edges, the tentative shape of something that had been allowed, at last, to name itself. "He was right," Edmund said. Clara closed her hand around the miniature. The snow fell outside the east gallery of Hartwell Hall, and the portrait faced outward for the first time in 9 years, and somewhere below them, the household was beginning the morning, and the fire in the east room had been laid and was burning, and her father was reading at his usual table with his usual hours, and for the first time in Clara Cavendish's life, she knew every room in the house she was standing in, and every one of them was hers. If the question of where a life properly begins has been sitting with you as long as it sat with Clara, leave it in the comments, and she would have wanted to know she was not the only one. This story stays with you. I think you know why. The miniature was warm in her hand. She did not put it down.